It's now my pleasure to invite to the podium Brandt Hershman, Senator Brandt Hershman from Indiana, who is currently the majority whip in the state Senate there. In 2006, he introduced legislation that revamped the state regulatory framework for telecommunications. The bill received overwhelming bipartisan support and has been touted as the most progressive telecom reform legislation in the country. Brandt's topics today is a free market vision for telecom regulation. Please join me in welcoming Senator Brandt Hershman to the podium.
Good morning, and thanks to Brian for that introduction. Certainly thanks to the Heartland-Institute and Technology for Ohio's Tomorrow for their sponsorship of this forum. I jumped at the opportunity to come for a couple of reasons. One, I've been a longtime fan of the Heartland-Institute's work, and I think that any free market-oriented think tank who has the chutzpah to locate themselves in downtown Chicago deserves some measure of respect for their audacity, if nothing else. And of course, I say that as someone from Indiana who has a perennial chip on their shoulder about the state of Illinois, so I take my shots where I can. And also because I can identify with them. I thought that if they were willing to put their head in the mouth of the lion, as it were, locating in Chicago, I, as a legislator representing Purdue, would be willing to come to Columbus and put my head in the mouth of the lion as well, from an athletic rivalry standpoint. It's interesting that we find ourselves in these times. I printed out the compilation of the federal stimulus package and its impact upon the telecommunications sector. And I think that's unknown. Anytime you inject $7.2 billion into a sector of the economy, there's going to be an impact, and there will certainly be regulations to be written. There are inevitably winners and losers from such an investment, and yet the goal of improving access to technology across the country, especially in underserved or unserved areas, is admirable. It's just that historically, government attempts to regulate that type of market penetration have been somewhat less than successful, regardless of the intent. And so if I were to say to you that you had the opportunity to spur investment and job creation to help your businesses innovate in your state, to create a long-term advantage for the state of Ohio in terms of economic competitiveness, and it wouldn't cost you a dime, I might have your attention. And that's where the state of Indiana found itself in 2006. And Hans Haney had very kind remarks early on about the efforts in Indiana, and I said to him that it was the product of frustration. It was a product of frustration for me. I have only served in the Indiana Senate since the year 2000, but I've been involved in politics and government service for coming on 20 years. I worked in the Bush White House as a writer. I've been the district chief of staff for a member of Congress since 1992 and continue to do that with Indiana's part-time legislature. And because of that, a member of Congress I worked for, Steve Buyer, served on the Judiciary Committee in 1996 when the original Telco DREG Act was passed. And Steve was a conferee on that act. So I had some opportunity to be involved in the policy debate that occurred at the federal level with respect to where communications policy was headed. And with that history in mind, at the end of 2005, we had a long session, budget writing session of the General Assembly, and we had a bill that I think was the second or third time that Indiana had sought to pursue some limited type of deregulation. We had an alternative regulation statute, but we were trying to take it one step further, and it got as far as 3 signatures on a conference report and died. And at this point, I just got mad. And I walked into the telecommunications community and said, all right, guys, I want to do this next time. And here I was, a less than senior legislator. And I said, here's my rules. I do it my way. I put together my bill, no interference. And I think they gave me this slightly amused smile and patted me on the head and said, go ahead, son, have fun. And my wife has still not entirely forgiven me because I sat down on the couch in our living room along with a stack of papers about this high, Google is a wonderful thing, and I started looking at what every state in the nation had done with respect to telecommunications reform, what had worked, what hadn't. It was what businesses quite often do, a survey of best practices, something that government is not typically very excited about doing. And I don't say that in a really negative way. Business has a profit motive. You always have to be aware of what your customers want, need, and what your competition is doing. And even then, it's difficult. I have an article posted above my desk from the Wall Street Journal from about a year ago that is an entire listing of personal motivations for people and companies and how difficult it is for them to change. And I reminded myself of that. I not only serve as the whip, I'm the new chairman of the Senate Tax Committee, and we're looking at making several changes in Indiana in terms of government restructuring. Necessity being the mother of invention, it was fortuitous that we had already undertaken a review of our system of government. Indiana has more elected officials than most any state in the nation. And yet, while we face economic hard times and the incontrovertible evidence that we've got more officials per capita than almost anyone else, the aversion to any sort of meaningful change is there, and it's strong. And I like to think that however difficult the status quo is, there's some level of comfort because it's a known. Times may be tough, but at least I know what to expect. And that's kind of the situation I felt Indiana was in with respect to telecommunications law. I know that AT&T's CEO had said at one point that they thought it was one of the two worst states in the nation in which to engage in the telecommunications business. And of course, as you can guess, that really led to a great deal of investment in the state of Indiana, where you had a regulatory environment that was largely despised by the telecommunications community itself. And whether that was entirely deserved or not, I leave to personal opinion, but I did know what the actual impact of that was, and that was that we were lagging the nation significantly in terms of broadband deployment. We had no video competition whatsoever, and we had an existing code that had been written in a very different time. So, sitting on the living room floor with that stack of papers, I sketched the outline of a bill. And I went into the telco sector first and I said, here's what I'm planning on doing. And there was kind of this shocked silence because it far exceeded anything that they had hoped to accomplish. And they thought I was nuts for trying to do it in a short session of the Indiana General Assembly, 60 days. Who can do this in that period of time? And I said, you know what? You can do a lot of things in a short period of time if you bring on the right set of partners. So I did a handful of things right after that. Number one, and it's another reason I'm here today, I flew to Texas. And I sat down with Phil King, the author of Texas's video choice law, telco deregulation law, really arguably the first in the nation to make such a sweeping proposal.